You've noticed it, haven't you? The messages that used to flood your phone have slowed. Invitations that once came effortlessly now arrive sparsely or not at all. And for a moment, it stings like rejection. You wonder, am I being left behind? Did I do something wrong? But what if the shrinking circle isn't about loss, but about God's work in your life? What if He's quietly removing distractions, testing loyalty, and preparing you for something far greater than you can see right now? Tonight, we're going to uncover why fewer people around you could actually be the clearest sign that you're moving into the destiny you were made for, and why the silence you feel might be the most important presence of all. God's sieve, when less becomes more. You look around one day and realize the circle is smaller, fewer messages, fewer voices. And even if you don't say it out loud, it hurts, because it feels like loss. It feels like something was taken from you. The silence raises uncomfortable questions. Did I change too much? Did I disappoint someone? Or worse, was I only valuable when I was useful? What we rarely notice is that loss and filtering feel the same at first. Both are quiet. Both are painful. But spiritually, they are very different things. God does not remove people out of cruelty. He filters out of purpose. What feels like subtraction is often alignment, and alignment almost always begins with discomfort. Gideon knew that feeling well. Standing before an army that finally made him feel secure, he must have thought, "Now I'm ready." But God interrupted that confidence with an unsettling command. There are too many people. Victory, God said, would not come through numbers, but through obedience. One by one, soldiers left, the noise faded, the crowd thinned, and faith was forced to stand on its own. That moment exposes a tension we all carry, the need for approval versus the courage to be set apart. We say we trust God, but we still crave witnesses. We want faith and applause, calling and company. Yet God often removes the audience so we can finally hear His voice without interference. In real life, this looks painfully ordinary. Some people were only present when there was excitement, advantage, or momentum. When growth demanded depth instead of entertainment, they quietly stepped back. And the temptation is to chase them, to lower standards, to become louder, funnier, easier, anything to avoid being alone. But solitude, when God is involved, is never empty. It is surgical. It cuts away distraction so devotion can survive. Intimacy with God rarely grows in crowded rooms. It grows in filtered spaces where obedience matters more than being liked. So if your circle is shrinking, don't rush to fill the gaps. Ask better questions. What is God protecting me from? What is He preparing me for? And who is meant to remain when convenience is gone? Gideon won with fewer, not despite them. Less became more because God was at the center. And sometimes, the clearest sign that God is close is that everything else gets quiet. Different callings, opposite paths. Not every goodbye comes with a fight. Some arrive quietly, without slammed doors or harsh words. One day you realize you're still walking, but not in the same direction as the people beside you. And that realization carries a strange mix of guilt and grief. Because part of you wonders if growing means abandoning, and if obedience somehow makes you selfish. No one prepares you for how heavy that question can feel. She tried to ignore it at first. Same friends, same conversations, same routines. But something inside her had shifted. Prayer had become deeper. Scripture started challenging her instead of just comforting her. While she was moving forward, others seemed content, staying on the same corner of life, replaying the same cycles. And instead of feeling inspired, she felt tired. Growth was costing her energy she didn't know how to explain. So she did what many sincere believers do. She tried to pull everyone along with her. She invited, encouraged, explained, insisted. If she could just bring them with her, maybe the guilt would go away. But carrying people who didn't want to move forward slowly drained her. What she called love was becoming exhaustion. and exhaustion has a way of clouding discernment. In prayer, the question finally surfaced. Am I being arrogant or am I being obedient? That question didn't come with an immediate answer, but it came with clarity. Unity, she realized, doesn't mean uniformity. God doesn't call everyone to the same pace, the same sacrifice, or the same destination. Different callings naturally create different paths, even when the love is real. Scripture echoes this tension through Abraham's story. God tells him to leave without giving details. No full map, no timeline, just a direction and a promise. Leaving the familiar wasn't betrayal, it was obedience. And obedience often requires walking without the comfort of familiar faces applauding your steps. Abraham didn't leave because he stopped loving. He left because he trusted. That's the quiet conflict many people face. Pleasing people keeps relationships comfortable, but it can keep calling dormant. Saying yes to God sometimes sounds like no to others, even when your heart is gentle. And the hardest part is accepting that not everyone will understand your obedience, especially those who benefited from you staying the same. If you've ever felt torn between loyalty and direction, you're not alone. Growth doesn't always come with cheers. Sometimes it comes with silence and misunderstanding, but direction, once chosen, brings a peace that approval never could. And while paths may diverge, obedience keeps you aligned with where God is leading next. The weight of healing, when you no longer fit. Healing sounds beautiful until you realize it changes your shape, not just emotionally, but relationally. The places you once fit into with ease now feel tight, uncomfortable, almost foreign. Conversations you used to enjoy start draining you. Jokes you once laughed at now land differently, and part of you misses the old version of yourself, not because it was healthier, but because it belonged everywhere without resistance. There's a quiet grief that comes with becoming whole. You remember the version of you who said yes to everything, laughed through pain, stayed longer than necessary, just to avoid being alone. That version was convenient, predictable, easy to keep around. Healing introduces boundaries, and boundaries tend to unsettle people who benefited from your lack of them. He feels it deeply, the tension between who he was and who he's becoming. There are moments when loneliness whispers seductive lies. Just go back. Just loosen the limits. Just be the old you again. Not because it was right, but because it was familiar. Healing doesn't erase temptation, it reframes it. The pull backward feels stronger when the cost of moving forward is isolation. Scripture names this shift with uncomfortable clarity. The old has passed away. That verse isn't poetic, it's confrontational. Because when old things pass, old spaces do too. God doesn't heal you so you can keep surviving in environments that made you sick. He heals you so you can recognize when something threatens the freedom he gave you. Freedom, however, comes with a strange side effect. Fewer people understand it. Some interpret your growth as distance. Others label your boundaries as pride. And there's a moment where you ask yourself if healing was worth the relational cost. That question isn't sinful, it's human. Even Jesus experienced distance when truth replaced tolerance. But here's what slowly becomes clear. God isn't transforming you to isolate you. He's aligning you. Alignment feels like loneliness before it feels like peace. It feels like standing alone before standing supported. The silence isn't punishment, it's transition. Space is being made for relationships that can handle the healed version of you. If you feel like you no longer fit where you once did, don't rush to shrink yourself again. Healing changes your dimensions for a reason. Some rooms are too small for who you're becoming, and while the freedom may feel lonely right now, it's carrying you toward connections that won't require you to break yourself to belong. Take a moment to reflect. Have you ever noticed your circle shrinking when you started growing spiritually or setting boundaries? Drop a comment below and share your experience. Your story might encourage someone who feels alone right now. Spiritual hunger reveals companionship. There's a moment when life stops being performative and starts being honest. Trouble shows up unannounced. Anxiety creeps into your thoughts. Family pressure, emotional fatigue, unanswered prayers. And suddenly, you're no longer the one bringing energy into the room. You're the one quietly needing support. That's when the circle really starts to change. Not because you asked it to, but because hunger exposes motives. At first, you don't notice it. You still show up. You still listen. But the roles have shifted. You're no longer serving bread. You're asking for prayer. And that subtle change makes some people uncomfortable. They liked you best when you were strong, helpful, optimistic. Need introduces tension. Vulnerability disrupts convenience. And slowly, without confrontation, distance grows. Scripture tells a painfully familiar story through the prodigal son. When there was money, there were friends. When there was celebration, there was company. But when the resources ran out, so did the relationships. Hunger revealed the truth. The absence of voices wasn't random. It was revelatory. It showed who was drawn to the feast and who was committed to the person. The modern version looks quieter but feels just as sharp. You send a message instead of posting a highlight. You ask for prayer instead of offering advice, and the replies slow down. Some don't come at all. Silence replaces noise, and it stings because silence feels like abandonment. But silence can also be an answer you didn't expect God to use. In that quiet stretch, something shifts internally. The need for an audience gives way to the need for presence. You realize that God isn't competing with people for your attention. He's revealing where you placed your security. When human support fades, divine sustenance becomes unmistakable. What once felt like lack starts feeling like clarity. Spiritual hunger has a way of refining focus. It strips away performative faith and replaces it with dependence. You stop chasing affirmation and start seeking presence, not because you're stronger, but because you're honest. And honesty creates space for God to meet you where performance never could. So if your circle feels thinner during a hard season, don't assume you're being punished. Hunger doesn't destroy faith, it matures it, and the companions who remain when there's nothing to offer but truth are often the ones God uses to walk with you into what comes next. When God closes social doors, at first it feels subtle. Fewer invites, shorter replies, conversations that once flowed now end quickly. You tell yourself not to overthink it, but the pattern becomes hard to ignore. And if you're honest, it messes with your sense of value. Because when doors close socially, the mind jumps to one conclusion. I must have done something wrong. She feels it deeply. The unanswered messages, the gatherings she only hears about later, the sudden quiet from people who once needed her constantly. And in that quiet, insecurity gets loud. Maybe I became boring. Maybe I got too serious. Maybe I lost whatever made me desirable to be around. The fear isn't really about being alone, it's about being unwanted. What she doesn't see yet is that not every closed door is rejection. Some are protection. God doesn't just open paths forward. Sometimes He blocks exits backward. Environments where you had to perform to be accepted are rarely places where your soul can rest. When God starts closing those doors, it's often because He's done watching you shrink to fit rooms He never designed for you. There's a moment in prayer where the inner dialogue shifts. The mind says, "You've become boring." The Spirit says, "You've become holy." Not perfect, not untouchable, but set apart. And being set apart always comes with fewer seats at certain tables. Not because you're better, but because you're no longer available for everything. Temptation shows up disguised as nostalgia. Just go back for one night. Just respond the way you used to. Just blend in again. Inclusion feels so close if you're willing to compromise a little. And that's where the tension sharpens. Comfort versus conviction. Familiarity versus freedom. The choice isn't dramatic, but it's decisive. Scripture frames God as a shepherd, not a crowd manager. A shepherd leads sheep away from cliffs they can't see, even when the sheep resist, even when they don't understand. Closed doors are often God pulling you away from emotional precipices disguised as social acceptance. Protection rarely feels gentle in the moment. So if social doors are closing, resist the urge to pry them back open. Ask instead what God might be rescuing you from. Silence doesn't mean loss of value. Sometimes it means the end of performance. And that kind of quiet creates room for something truer to take shape. When the light grows, the circle shrinks. There's a noticeable shift when you start saying no to things you once tolerated. Not loudly, not arrogantly, just quietly choosing differently. And almost immediately, the atmosphere changes. The jokes land awkwardly. The conversations pause longer than usual. You feel it in the room before anyone says it out loud. You're still there, but you're no longer the same. He didn't plan to stand out. That was never the goal. He just stopped agreeing with what didn't sit right anymore. Small choices at first, different boundaries, cleaner language, a refusal to laugh at certain things, nothing dramatic. But light doesn't need to be loud to be disruptive. It only needs to be present. That's when the labels start showing up. He used to be one of us. Now he's the church guy. The tone changes, comments carry irony, playful jabs hide real discomfort, and internally the battle begins. Am I overdoing it? Am I being extreme? Or am I simply refusing to dim what God is growing in me? Scripture has walked this road before. Daniel and his friends didn't shout sermons in Babylon. They simply chose faithfulness when compromise was easier. They didn't attack culture. They resisted assimilation, and that resistance came with isolation, misunderstanding, and pressure. Holiness always costs something socially, even when it's practiced quietly. What makes this season difficult is the temptation to self-edit, to soften convictions so the tension eases, to blend just enough to be included again. And that temptation feels reasonable because no one likes feeling like the outsider. But integrity is rarely comfortable before it becomes stable. Faithfulness often feels lonely before it feels rewarding. Light exposes without speaking. It reveals what others would rather keep hidden, and that can create distance fast. Not because you're judging, but because presence alone forces reflection. And reflection isn't welcomed by everyone. Some people prefer familiarity over growth, even if familiarity keeps them stuck. So when the circle shrinks as the light grows, don't assume you're doing something wrong. Sometimes the discomfort around you is confirmation, not correction. Being faithful may leave you alone for a moment, but it never leaves you abandoned. And what's forming in this quiet resistance is preparing you for connections that won't require you to dim to belong. You mistook the crowd for love. For a long time, being surrounded felt like being secure. Notifications came fast. Messages stacked up. Invitations made you feel chosen. And somewhere along the way, quantity quietly replaced depth. You didn't notice it happening because attention feels warm even when it's shallow. But when something finally went wrong, the noise disappeared almost overnight. He sits there staring at his phone, scrolling without purpose. The silence is louder than the crowd ever was. The people who laughed the most, who praised the loudest, who benefited from his availability are suddenly unreachable. And the question hits harder than the absence itself. If I'm not useful, am I still wanted? That question cuts deep because it exposes a truth most people avoid. Not all attention is affection. Some people don't love you. They love access to you, your energy, your generosity, your presence when it serves them. And when access disappears, so does the relationship. What feels like abandonment is often revelation. Jesus lived inside this tension constantly. Crowds followed him for miracles, food, healing, and spectacle. They praised him loudly when he gave them what they wanted, But when suffering showed up, when obedience led to the cross, the crowd vanished. Only a few remained. Love didn't disappear. It was simply revealed. There's a painful humility in realizing you confused being surrounded with being known, being applauded with being valued. The crowd never asked how you were doing because your role was to keep things moving. When you stopped performing, the system didn't know what to do with you anymore. This is where God begins a quieter work. He strips away performance-based relationships so identity can finally breathe. Love that depends on output is exhausting. God's love doesn't fluctuate with usefulness. It doesn't retreat when you're tired, broken, or silent. It stays when there's nothing to offer. So when the crowd fades, resist the urge to chase it back. Let the emptiness teach you discernment. Let God redefine love as presence, not popularity, because what you're losing right now isn't love at all, it's access. And what remains is the beginning of something far more real. The pain of not being invited and the healing of identity. There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't announce itself loudly. You find it while scrolling. A photo here, a story there, laughter captured mid-moment, and suddenly your chest tightens. Life went on without you. No explanation, no warning, just evidence. And the thought you didn't ask for shows up anyway. I was replaced. She tries to be mature about it, tells herself it shouldn't matter. But it does, because being excluded doesn't just hurt socially, it questions identity. Was I forgettable? Did I matter less than I thought? The wound isn't about missing the event. It's about feeling erased from a narrative you once belonged to. The instinctive response is to react, to post something, to prove you're fine, to remind people you still exist. Visibility becomes a coping mechanism, but God interrupts that impulse gently, yet firmly. He invites her into a quieter place, not hidden out of shame, but hidden for healing. A space without an audience. Scripture points to this place as the secret room, the place where no one claps, where no one compares, where identity is rebuilt without performance. God meets her there, not to scold the ache, but to expose its source. The need to be seen had quietly become the need to be validated, and validation, once lost, leaves a hollow ache. Tears come without warning. Honest prayers replace curated words. In that stillness, something shifts. She realizes how much of her worth was tied to being included, to being remembered, to being chosen publicly. God doesn't shame her for that realization. He heals it, slowly, gently, completely. Comparison loses its grip in secret places. Contentment grows where applause can't reach. Identity strengthens when it's no longer borrowed from proximity to others. And while the pain of exclusion doesn't disappear overnight, it stops defining her. She begins to understand that being unseen by people doesn't mean being overlooked by God. If you've ever felt that sting of not being invited, don't rush past it. Let it reveal what it needs to. God isn't calling you away from people out of neglect. He's calling you into a deeper knowing of who you are when no one is watching. And that knowing changes everything that comes next. If this message resonates, consider sharing it with a friend who might need to hear this. Sometimes God uses our smallest circles to reveal His biggest purposes. When you grow, not everyone celebrates. Growth sounds inspiring until you experience it alone. Habits change, priorities shift. You start choosing prayer over patterns, discipline over escape, truth over comfort. On the inside, it feels like progress. On the outside, it feels like distance. The people who once knew your routines now seem unsure how to relate to this new version of you. He thought change would be welcomed. After all, growth is a good thing, right? Fewer destructive habits, more clarity, more stability. But instead of encouragement, he senses hesitation. Conversations grow shorter, support becomes selective. And slowly, he realizes something unsettling. Some people preferred the version of him that was struggling. That realization hurts in a very specific way, because it suggests that your brokenness made others comfortable. Your healing forces them to confront what they've avoided. Growth has a way of exposing insecurity, even when no one says it out loud. And instead of celebrating your progress, some people quietly step back. Scripture captures this tension through Joseph. When he shared the dream God placed in him, it wasn't applause he received. It was rejection, distance, betrayal. The dream didn't make him arrogant. It made others uncomfortable, and discomfort, when left unchecked, often turns into resistance. In everyday life, resistance looks subtle. Sarcastic comments, delayed responses, a lack of support when you need it most. These micro-rejections don't shout, they whisper, and the danger lies in the question they provoke. Should I dim my growth just to stay connected? That question marks a critical moment, because shrinking yourself might restore familiarity, but it suffocates calling. God never asked you to grow so you could hide it. He asked you to grow so you could bear fruit, and fruitfulness often creates space between those who are growing and those who are standing still. So when growth costs you celebration, don't assume you're wrong. Sometimes the absence of applause is confirmation that change is real. Not everyone will clap when you rise, but God never called you to fit, He called you to flourish. The test of time, who stays without advantage. Time has a way of doing what confrontation never could. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain, it simply reveals. Seasons change, energy shifts, and suddenly you're no longer in a position to give, fix, or provide. You're just present. And that's when relationships are tested at their deepest level, not by conflict, but by inconvenience. At first, he doesn't notice the shift. He assumes people are busy, life happens, everyone goes through phases. But as weeks stretch into months, patterns become harder to ignore. When there's no progress to celebrate, no benefit to gain, no momentum to attach themselves to, some connections quietly fade into the background. This is where the discomfort sharpens, because you're not asking for much, just presence, just honesty. Just someone to stay when there's nothing impressive happening, and the silence answers louder than words ever could. Some people were connected to your season, not your soul. Scripture tells this truth through Ruth's quiet loyalty. When advantage disappeared, when staying meant sacrifice instead of gain, she remained. She chose presence over convenience. And that choice revealed a depth of faithfulness that time alone could expose. Real allegiance doesn't rush off when conditions change. In modern life, this test feels deeply personal. You hesitate before asking for help, not wanting to burden anyone. Pride tells you to endure quietly. But humility slowly teaches you that being cared for by a few is richer than being admired by many. One answered call carries more weight than 100 unread messages. There's a strange peace that comes with this realization. Painful, yes, but clarifying. You stop over-investing where effort isn't mutual. You stop confusing longevity with loyalty. Time filters without emotion, leaving behind what can survive pressure, lack, and waiting. So if time has thinned your circle, don't resent it. Let it teach you discernment. Those who remain when there's no advantage are rare, but they are real. And what God builds through them is stronger than anything convenience could ever sustain. God changes your tribe before taking you higher. Before elevation comes relocation, even when no one warns you it's happening. One season you feel surrounded, understood, included. The next, you feel strangely alone, carrying a vision no one seems excited about. It's confusing because nothing is technically wrong. You're growing, opportunities are opening, yet the distance around you keeps expanding. He didn't ask for separation. In fact, he tried to prevent it. He explained himself. He slowed down. He waited for others to catch up. But the more he tried to bring everyone along, the heavier the journey became. Progress started to feel like betrayal, as if moving forward meant leaving people behind on purpose. That's when God begins to clarify something uncomfortable. Not everyone is assigned to every altitude. Some relationships are seasonal, not eternal. And seasons don't end because of failure. They end because of transition. Before God promotes you, He often rearranges who has access to your next level. Scripture paints this clearly through Moses. When it was time to climb the mountain, he couldn't bring everyone with him. Not because he didn't care, but because the calling required separation. Certain encounters with God only happen away from the crowd. Elevation demands focus, and focus doesn't survive constant explanation. This is where fear creeps in. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of looking prideful. Fear that people will think you've changed for the worse. And to avoid that fear, many people delay obedience. They stay longer than they should, shrinking their calling just to preserve familiarity. But obedience eventually asks a hard question. Are you willing to be misinterpreted for the sake of direction? God doesn't remove people to punish you. He realigns your circle to support what He's about to entrust to you. Carrying new responsibility with old permissions creates unnecessary strain. So if you feel isolated right before a breakthrough, don't panic. Isolation at this stage isn't abandonment. It's transition. God is changing your tribe because where you're going requires different support, different understanding, and different strength. And what feels like loss now is often preparation for weight you couldn't carry before. When you stop negotiating values, the circle responds. It usually starts with something small, a comment you don't laugh at anymore, a conversation you quietly step away from, a situation where you used to stay silent, but now you choose honesty. You're not making speeches. You're not trying to prove anything. You're simply no longer negotiating what you know is right. And somehow, that changes the temperature of every room you enter. She feels it immediately. The pauses grow longer. The invitations become selective. People exchange glances when she says no, not with anger, but with surprise. Conviction has a way of disrupting unspoken agreements. When you stop participating in what once bonded you, the bond itself starts to loosen. The internal conflict is sharp. Am I becoming difficult? Am I being judgmental without realizing it? The fear isn't about losing people, it's about being misunderstood. Because there's a difference between standing firm and standing proud, and the line feels thin when you're the one standing alone. Scripture shows Jesus living in this tension constantly. He didn't negotiate truth to preserve comfort. He didn't soften conviction to maintain crowds. And because of that, many walked away, not because he lacked love, but because love spoken without compromise confronts what people would rather keep hidden. In real life, this moment is rarely dramatic. It's subtle. The group plans something questionable and waits for your response. You feel the pressure in the silence before you answer. Saying no doesn't feel bold, it feels terrifying. But when you finally speak, there's peace beneath the fear. Conviction steadies you even as the room shifts. What follows is distance, not because you attacked anyone, but because truth has a way of sorting alliances. When values become clear, some connections dissolve on their own. Not every separation needs conflict. Some happen naturally when integrity takes precedence over agreement. So if your circle changes when you stop negotiating values, don't interpret it as failure. Conviction will always cost proximity to certain spaces. But what remains is cleaner, lighter, and capable of growing with you. And that clarity sets the stage for something deeper still, even if you can't see it yet. Few on earth, many in heaven, the invisible company. When the circle has finally thinned, something unexpected happens. The noise is gone, the expectations are gone, and what remains feels uncomfortably quiet. At first, that quiet feels like absence, like something is missing. You notice the empty spaces where conversations used to be, the pauses where validation once lived. And in that stillness, you realize how much of your life was filled with voices that kept you distracted from your own soul. He feels alone, but not abandoned. That distinction takes time to understand. The loneliness is real, but it's different now. It doesn't feel chaotic. It feels intentional. In the quiet, prayer deepens. Scripture speaks with weight instead of familiarity. Tears come easier not from despair, but from honesty. For the first time, he isn't competing for attention. He's present. Scripture mirrors this moment through Elijah, exhausted and convinced he was the only one left. Alone, afraid, questioning everything. And God meets him not with rebuke, but with revelation. You are not as alone as you think. What Elijah couldn't see was the invisible company God had preserved all along. Faithful ones, aligned ones, prepared ones. The isolation was never the full picture. This is where perspective begins to shift. Fewer people on earth doesn't mean fewer connections in life. It means different ones, deeper ones. God starts introducing relationships that aren't loud but steady, not flashy but faithful. Mentors who speak truth, friends who pray instead of perform, companions who don't need you to be entertaining to stay present. The most powerful change happens internally. Value is no longer measured by proximity or popularity. Identity stops reacting to who stayed and who left. God becomes enough before people become additions again, and that order changes everything. When God fills the space first, relationships no longer carry the weight of worth. Slowly, hope replaces grief, not because everyone returns, but because you understand why they didn't. God reduced the circle not to deprive you, but to prepare you, not to isolate you, but to realign you. Reduction was never the destination, it was the process. And as new connections form, you realize something profound. God reduced what was temporary, so he could multiply what is eternal. What felt like loneliness was actually an invitation into purpose-driven community, spiritual family, and a depth of connection that couldn't exist before the filtering. The circle didn't shrink because you were losing something. It shrank because God was building something lasting. As your circle shrinks, remember this. It's never a reflection of your value, but a revelation of God's refining work. The friends who remain, the connections that endure, the quiet moments of prayer, they're the ones aligned with purpose, not convenience. Your identity isn't determined by who stays or leaves. It's rooted in the one who never abandons. Take a moment to reflect. Are you measuring worth by quantity or by the depth of faithfulness? If this message resonated, take action. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, or comment on what God is teaching you through the people he's placed around you. And don't stop here. The next story will take you even deeper, showing how God uses these seasons of solitude.